Okay, John asked me to start because the videotape is going, and I don't need to talk about the volunteers needed, but to start with a summary of what we're going to talk about today. And I think for the videotape, so he can start it rolling. First of all, I'm going to try to make all of you aware of the survivor benefits that still exist from the Delta Pilot Disability and Survivorship Plan. Secondly, I'm going to give you a method of a rough estimate of what that benefit would be. Then some details of the calculation. I don't want to get lost in that because they may get a little bit confusing. I'll give a couple of brief examples. There's a worksheet that I produced, and depending upon the time, we may be able to go through that, but it turned out to be like an IRS form. Then I want to discuss changes that occurred in bankruptcy. I'll review the latest information I have on the financial status of the plan, and finally discuss some of the potential threats to the future benefits. Even in the post-bankruptcy era, there still are survivor benefits available to eligible survivors of deceased retired pilots. Pilots who retired before January of this year are still eligible, or their survivors are still eligible. Who are the eligible survivors? Well, they're the legal spouse at the time of the pilot's death, children under 19 or 23 if they're still in school. There may be a few Bing Crosbys out there that have another generation of children that could be survivors. You have to be married for, I think it's at least a year before retirement, and or before disability. So that covers most of the people. How much can you get? Well, the easiest way to look at it, I talked with Dick the other day, and the easiest way is to think about what you were receiving from the Delta retirement plans prior to bankruptcy. And that's if you elected a lump sum distribution. Now, how many people out here elected a lump sum distribution? Probably just about the entire group. So if you elected a lump sum distribution, that was half of your retirement benefit. The other half is paid as an annuity. That amount that was being paid is approximately, a rough approximation of what your surviving spouse would receive. To get more precise, you can call 1-800-MY-DELTA and ask them for an estimate. At least they're still producing them today. I don't know if they will, if they're inundated with requests. But to be more precise, you'd have to look at taking your final average earnings that was used for retirement, which is the last 36 months of earnings, and taking 30% of that, correcting it for service under 25 years, and correcting it if you retired before age 60. So it was designed originally for the RDs who had over 25 years of service to give them 30% of their FAE. Their retirement benefit was 60% of their FAE. Guess what? That's why it's half of the benefit, roughly, and that's why it's what you were getting prior to bankruptcy. Now, there's another feature to it that's a variable benefit. And the variable benefit is based upon what happens to the funds. Now, what Delta has done in the past is that they have funds that went into this plan that was originally established in 1972. It became overfunded in the early years. In fact, this isn't in part of the script, but by 1994, Delta took a $114 million after-tax credit because of overfunding of the DNS plans, predominantly overfunding of the pilot DNS plan. Why did it grow to such a great amount? It's because early on ALPA asked for, demanded, and made concessions for very conservative actuarial assumptions. They didn't know how many pilots would disable. So in the early years, Delta was putting in a lot more money than was being taken out. So this grew. Delta took the funds from the DNS Trust, the funds from the pilot pension plans and other pension plans, and they aggregated all of those into what they called a master trust. The master trust then was invested in the stock market, or handed out to different money managers, and it did quite well. And that's why by 1994, with this increase in value of the assets, it became very, very well funded to the point that when Delta had to recognize another accounting change, which dealt with the liabilities associated with retiree benefits. That popped up in the 90s. And when Delta did that, they could show that they actually were overfunded in these areas. So Delta stopped making contributions to the plan, or didn't have to for a number of years. And there are many people that believe that the plan would have had enough assets to be self-sufficient from that point on if things didn't change. At any rate, back to the variable portion. So at the end of a year, they would take and figure out what the investment yield was on the master trust, and then divide it back up into the various plans that it invested in. And they would take a 5-year weighted average. So they'd take the most recent year, and that yield in the calendar year would be used 5 times. They would take the previous year 4 times, the previous year 3, 2, and 1. In the script, this is all actually back under the part of the variable benefit. But at any rate, they would then come up with a number, and they would divide that by 15, which is the number of years you would put into it, and it gave what is called a weighted average yield on the investments. They would subtract 6.5% from that, because that's the way it was written contractually. So if you had a 9% yield in a year, a 9% gain in the stock market or through your money managers, you would end up with a 2.5% variable increase that year. Now, that really becomes important for pilots who retired years ago, because the variable benefit on their survivor's benefit starts the day they retire. So where Dick Deeds retired in 94? Okay, so you would end up going back in, we'd have to take a look at what the value of the units were in 1994 and what they are today,